Welcome to another episode of Forgotten Uniques, and this one is dedicated to a very persistent viewer who's been waiting sort of patiently for this item to appear in the series for a while at this point. Well, you needn't wait any longer. Let's get into it. In this series, I'm covering unique items in Path of Exile that aren't being used very much at the moment, taking a look at how exactly they function and how they interact with other mechanics in the game, especially in regards to some of the more recent additions, such as Ascendancy reworks or new unique items. Today's video is all about the Iron Mass, a unique one-handed sword which was added to the game in patch 3.12 Heist League as part of the exclusive loot from Heist content. The Iron Mass can rarely appear as a reward at the end of a blueprint wing. Let's take a look at the modifiers on the Iron Mass. 175 to 200% increased physical damage. This local increased physical damage roll is very high. The same modifier on a crafted one-handed sword can roll up to 179% increased physical damage at tier 1, so when rolling above that, this modifier on the Iron Mass is more like the equivalent of a tier 0 or higher modifier. However, the Iron Mass notably lacks a local flat added physical damage modifier to take advantage of this large percentage of increased physical damage. Though you can rarely obtain a corrupted implicit for flat added physical damage, with the highest tier of this modifier requiring item level 84 to have a chance to roll. Do be aware though that if you go for this modifier, you'll lose the global accuracy implicit, which may be an important stat to have, as we'll discuss later. Next is a local attack speed modifier, 14 to 18% increased attack speed. In comparison to the increased physical damage, this one is much lower in terms of modifier magnitude when looking at modifier tiers on crafted weapons, with 14 to 18% increased attack speed being the equivalent of a tier 4 or even a tier 5 modifier depending on the role. With that said, however, this is another useful stat considering the nature of this unique sword, which we'll get to in just a moment. Next up, Unholy Might. This modifier will grant the Unholy Might buff to the wielder of this sword. Unholy Might converts 100% of physical damage into chaos damage and provides a 25% chance to inflict Withered on hit. Withered is a debuff which makes an entity take 6% increased chaos damage for 2 seconds and stacks up to 15 times. Now, before we get into Unholy Might and the implications that it may have, it's probably best to first introduce the two unique modifiers on the Iron Mass. Summoned skeleton warriors and soldiers wield this weapon while in your main hand, and summoned skeleton warriors and soldiers deal triple damage with this weapon if you've hit with this weapon recently. So everything we've discussed up to this point now becomes a lot more interesting in the context of summoned skeletons using this sword and dealing the damage with the character being more of a support to those minions, providing them the tools to do so. Firstly, the Iron Mass must be wielded in the main hand for your skeletons to also use this sword. Equipping it in the offhand will not work. Secondly, it's important to note which types of skeletons will use the Iron Mass. Skeletons summoned using the normal summon skeletons are warriors, so these will take on the Iron Mass. However, skeletons summoned using either of the transfigured versions of the gem, that's summoned skeletons of archers and summoned skeletons of mages, will of course not work because they're not warriors or soldiers, and they're not melee. In the case of Vaal summoned skeletons, an army of skeletons will be created, of which the majority are soldiers and they will take on the Iron Mass, the rest will not. Now, a build using the Iron Mass requires quite an active playstyle because not only does it make use of summoned skeletons, which are slow and need to be resummoned often, but the second special modifier on this unique sword requires the character to hit with this weapon at least once every 4 seconds to maintain the triple damage buff for the skeletons. In a mapping scenario, this is a bit less relevant since you'll be using Leap Slam or even Whirling Blades to move around, constantly tagging enemies to maintain the buff. However, for bossing, where the triple damage consistency is going to be more important, you need to ensure that you're able to land an attack with the main hand at least once every 4 seconds for optimal damage output. Leap Slam and Whirling Blades are still decent options here, but less ideal for bossing. Lancing Steel of Spraying is also a good option. However, there may be a superior option to all of those: Smite. The reason for Smite potentially being a great option is because the triple damage buff for your skeletons. So let's discuss that for a moment. The Iron Mass replaces the default damage, attack speed, and critical strike chance of your summoned skeletons with the stats that are provided by this unique sword. And this makes the scaling of a build using the Iron Mass particularly interesting because the damage is no longer scaled based on gem levels like on most minion builds, but instead it's scaled by flat damage sources for your skeletons. Because as long as you're able to make that main hand attack every 4 seconds, any flat damage you can provide to your skeletons will be tripled when they attack using the Iron Mass. Gem levels are still somewhat useful to provide an extra summoned skeleton at level 21, and also to increase your skeleton's accuracy rating per level, but it's no longer an axis for damage scaling. This is also why the Iron Mass's accuracy implicit may come in handy to improve your skeleton's hit chance compared to a minion build with much higher gem level scaling. Because flat damage sources are the main way to scale damage, this is where Smite comes into play. Smite is an attack skill which creates an aura which provides flat added lightning damage for you and nearby allies. The buff conveniently lasts 4 seconds, so keeping up will coincide with keeping the triple damage buff up for your skeletons as well. If you're using Smite, you can also make use of Vile Smite for a stronger version of the aura when you need a bit more burst damage. The flat lightning damage from Smite's aura scales extremely well with gem levels, which makes March of the Legion an ideal unique to pair with the Iron Mass. These unique boots grant a lot of gem levels for socketed aura gems, and a corrupted pair can grant even more gem levels with the right corruptions. Going from level 20 to 25, Smite's aura goes from granting 12 to 220 lightning damage to 17 to 327. That's around 50% more added damage. But March of the Legion also supports socketed gems with level 25 Divine Blessing, a support which allows a usually permanent aura to be cast as a temporary buff. And at level 25, it will also increase the supported aura's effect by 34%. To synergize with Smite and make damage scaling a little bit easier, you can also make use of Wrath for this purpose. But be aware that you'll need to be able to use the Divine Blessing aura with its large added mana cost from the level 25 Divine Blessing, which is usually solved using Eldritch Battery, or by stacking reduced mana cost modifiers, or both. Now, since your skeletons will be dealing the damage, you don't need to be affected by the lightning damage auras, so you can make use of Generosity support for even more aura effect to boost the added damage to your skeletons for both of these abilities. So let's take a look at a basic example for a setup using the Iron Mass and March of the Legion socketed with Smite, Wrath, and Generosity support. A level 25 Smite aura grants 17 to 327 added lightning damage, and this gem is linked to Generosity, which is also improved to level 25 because it also has an aura tag, providing 44% increased aura effect, and so Smite's aura would then grant 24 to 470 added lightning damage to your nearby skeletons. A level 25 Wrath grants 22 to 351 added lightning damage to attacks, and this gem is also linked to Generosity, but it's also supported by that level 25 Divine Blessing as well, for a total 78% increased aura effect. Wrath's aura would then grant 39 to 624 added lightning damage to attacks of your nearby skeletons. These auras combined would add 63 to 1094 flat lightning damage to your skeleton's attacks, which would then be tripled as long as you've attacked with the Iron Mass on your character in the last 4 seconds. And this is just a basic example. The gem levels for Smite and Wrath could be considerably higher. For example, the gems could be corrupted to begin with to be level 21, the March of the Legion could be corrupted as mentioned earlier for socketed aura or AoE gem levels, or even both for an additional 4 gem levels for a total possible 9 gem levels just from these boots alone. And you can also use Empower in the final slot if you wanted to for even more gem levels. And that is going to be a lot of flat added damage to be tripled by your skeletons. In this kind of setup, you want to focus solely on scaling the lightning damage as the main portion of damage, using things such as conductivity and exposure to boost damage output. Essentially, just using the Iron Mass for its triple damage boost and ignoring the Unholy Might portion of the unique. Speaking of exposure, most of those setups will want to use Elemental Equilibrium, combined with Avatar of Fire, so that the character's hits with Smite only deal fire damage, which then procs a large exposure to lightning damage, which your skeletons can then take advantage of. However, aside from this setup using March of the Legion to scale a bunch of added lightning damage, There's another good option which uses a different unique to scale chaos damage instead, and this setup takes advantage of the Unholy Might portion of the Iron Mass. Severed in Sleep is another unique one-handed sword with a focus on minions. This unique weapon provides a much larger chance to inflict Withered for minions, whilst also providing another avenue to scale damage via crits. But importantly, it grants level 25 Envy, an aura which is only obtainable from a handful of places in the game, and every other source of this aura only provides a level 15 version of the skill, which is much weaker. Envy is an aura which grants added chaos damage for attacks and spells, and by using Severed in Sleep in the offhand, you'll be able to maintain the requirement for having the Iron Mass in your main hand so your skeletons can use the sword, whilst gaining access to the Envy aura. Just like with the lightning damage setup, you can make use of Generosity and Divine Blessing by socketing those support gems into Severed in Sleep, which will allow the Envy aura to be cast as a temporary buff and boost up with a bunch of increased aura effect, providing a lot more added chaos damage for your skeletons. Since both the lightning setup and the chaos setup are heavily reliant on auras to scale flat added damage, they pair very well with the champion's Inspirational Ascendancy Notable for a big chunk of aura effects to further boost damage output. Notably, the chaos version of the Iron Mass build using Envy makes better use of Unholy Might, being able to put the physical base damage of the sword to work, as all of your skeleton's damage will then be chaos, so you can fully focus on that damage type using Despair and the Withered debuffs to their full effect to help boost your skeleton's damage output. However, the lightning version is likely to be the stronger build overall, able to obtain a lot more flat added damage due to the additional aura, while Smite's 4-second aura synergizes nicely, matching up with the timing of Iron Mass's triple damage modifier requirement. In terms of other sources of flat added damage for skeletons, the Anger aura grants flat added fire damage, though it's significantly harder to scale than the Envy or Smite and Wrath setups. Then there's also the added damage support gems, which may prove to be valuable considering the triple damage boost. And speaking of support gems, volatility should be mentioned in regards to the lightning damage setup, as the more maximum damage provides huge value, while the less minimum damage barely has any effect, because of the added lightning damage already having very low minimum added damage. There's also Ghastly Eye Jewels, which can be used to gain a lot of flat added damage for your minions. These can be socketed into a Darkness Enthroned unique belt to boost the strength of those modifiers on those socketed jewels. However, the strongest version of an Iron Mass build, albeit also the most expensive, is of course going to be one using the Adorned, to increase the effect of flat added damage modifiers for your minions on those magic Ghastly Eye Jewels that are socketed into your passive skill tree. That's going to be a lot of damage, but as I said, also a very, very expensive option, because it's the Adorned and most builds gravitate towards the item in late stages of progression because of just how strong it is. Now, I don't usually recommend guides in this series, but since this one was so recent and it's so well put together, and it has a variant for both softcore and hardcore, I just have to mention it here. Check out Phaze's guide to Lightning Summoned Skeletons featuring the Iron Mass. I'll link the video in the description below. Alright, so even with that incredible guide just in time for Necropolis League launch, why is it that so few characters are using the Iron Mass in Necropolis? Why isn't it being used more often? Well, here's a reason not mentioned in any other of the videos so far in this series. The Iron Mass playstyle simply isn't for everyone. Skeletons are slow, they need to be resummoned often, you need to maintain your buffs and ensure you're attacking once every 4 seconds. And that's pretty much it really. When built correctly, the Iron Mass is very good. Thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel. I appreciate it a lot. If you enjoy the content I make here on YouTube, check out the Patreon that I've linked in the description below for details on how you can support this channel going forward. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.